let's look into the history of the Old West. In the settling of the West, this is a period of time after the Civil War ended, 1865, and it goes up to the year about 1900. I say about because some people put it less and more. But that basic 15 years from after the Civil War, 65, 75, 1980s, I don't know, about 15 years after the Civil War, you get to the 1880s. You still got High West. 1880s to the 1900s, you start getting to the railroad stuff. So, well, it depends on who you speak to. That's how history and historians work. Anyhow, there's a lot of settling of the West with first the settlers, but we're going to focus on the ranchers and miners. Now, the growth of the mining industry. The West had rich deposits of gold, silver, and copper. All three of those very significant. And it served the needs of the growing industries in the East. As this industrial revolution is going on, electricity is starting to get up. You're going to look at copper as a significant metal. Also, that brought the first wave of settlers that populated the mountain states of the West. So these metals brought people out into those territories. Here's an old photo of Deadwood, Dakota. It would be Dakota Territory, which was very large indeed. There was the Dakota Territory and a very large Idaho Territory, and those broke up into smaller territories. Early prospectors would extract shallow deposits of ore, as in up on the top of the ground, largely by hand in a process called placer mining, using simple equipment like picks, shovels, and pans. And placer mining, it's like staking your place, but here's a photograph. If you see, they have the running water, and that is also a kind of what they call a sluice action. The water runs down, and the gold is heavier in weight, and it's probably not as rushing as it appears here. It's a long timed photograph, and the action of panning is also because the gold weighs more and it settles down to the bottom. But that old-fashioned pan for gold, and it's all panned out here, and let's see if it pans out. That's all from this placer mining is what these fellows are doing. Now, Indiana City, Montana, here's a photo of someone just hitting areas where they can find ore and gold. And this one, it looks a little like gotten up into the hills or down there. After surface deposits dwindled, corporations would move in to begin quartz mining, which dug deep beneath the surface. As those deposits dried up, commercial mining disappeared or continued on a restricted basis. If the ore had enough content, it would make it cost effective. However, quartz mining here is where you go from placer mining, where the gold is already loose in a sense. Gold occurs geologically in quartz, in veins of quartz. So they would pick around and they find a vein of quartz, like regular quartz. It's like, and they would follow those. But they would dig out these large chunks of rocks. So it started to go from the placer miner, and they're doing their individual stakes, and they'd have to protect their own stakes, to commercial mining. Here you see a leftover of a stamp mill. This is just like the structure of the stamp inside the stamp mill. They would bring the ore in here, all contained within quartz, and this thing was powered wheel, powered by a large belt attached to however they're maneuvering this. A lot of times it was a hydro powered, it was driven by flowing water many times. And then as this spun, these things would stamp up and down like pistons. And that's the stamping. More like stomping, they should have called it. Stomp, stomp, stomp. But these things were large iron pistons and stamped the quartz and pulverized it. That is a stamp mill. These stamp mills turned this more commercial mining. They go up in the mountains and they'd have these rather larger buildings. If you look into ghost towns, as in abandoned old gold towns, and here they are standing next to a stamp mill, another large structure of it. And this guy isn't a ghost, it's just a long-term photograph and got a little double exposure going on. Then came the Comstock load.
Arrived in Virginia City, Nevada in 1873 to seek his fortune in the fabled silver mines of the Comstock lode.
Oh my goodness, there's an embedded audio. I made this a while back. Anyhow, the Comstock lode of Nevada was very famous because as it got started, you see, you want to understand that a lot of this is a huge silver mine at some point. It just became this tremendously large silver mine, and the silver is very pure. But these things start off when people are exploring, like those placer mining, and they're digging a little exploration pit, doing the searching, and they find some gold. This is how it starts. Many times they find a little gold, and then they pan out, or they mine out that small amount of gold, and then they're digging underneath the gold and they find a little silver. Well, okay, let's keep going. So usually this thing would have been like a 1% gold at start, and then it's just running on the silver. So it was a big strike in Nevada, 1859. Henry Comstock, he staked it in the 6 Mile Canyon region, and it turned out to be very pure silver ore. And this is how when people rush a claim, they call it a stampede. And this is what a stampede looks like on a larger industrial scale, you might say. And these are longitudinal sections, so this is cross section. Look at how far all these things went down, these mining pits. And these are claims. I'm drawn on in this old map, the Washoe mining claims. News of the Comstock Strike brought hordes of miners to Virginia City. That's called a stampede. Almost overnight, the town turned into a boom town of about 30,000 people. That's huge for 1800s. During the booms, crime posed a serious problem. Prospectors fought over claims, and thieves haunted the streets and trails. Not many law enforcers, so vigilante committees were formed to track down and punish wrongdoers. Not many law enforcers. You see, these are territories. They're not state governments, they're territories. So anything to do with government is purely federal, which means that their judges are appointed by the president. The deputies and people like that are appointed. So if they're not around and the rest is just open, that's why they formed vigilante committees. So these vigilante committees started off, really the first ones were more in the California. It became a state before these areas were territories, and they formed a vigilante committee there. And then in the territories, vigilante committees were formed by copycatting that earlier one as a template. So the vigilante committees popped up here and popped up there. There's an earlier one in Montana, 1863, and I'll get deeper into that one later. It's the story of Bannack. And then later, vigilante committees were dealing with horse thieves and cattle rustlers as well. It got overboard. There's other bonanzas of the precious metals, gold near Pikes Peak in Colorado in 1858, and set them on another stampede. The phrase Pike Peak or bust came about as many panned for gold without success, headed back home and complained of the Pikes Peak hoax. And people would go to these places, and this is probably more of a settler's covered wagon trail. These covered wagon trails would later turn into train tracks, train rail systems. These are just trails that they paved over, but they would go out there and looking for that gold. There was plenty of gold and silver in the Colorado mountains, but much of it was hidden beneath the surface and hard to extract. Leadville, so called for deep deposits of lead that contained large amounts of silver, was one of the richest of the strikes. So they started improving the transportation out to the Western Territories because of basically the mining promises. The Leadville bonanza spurred the building of railroads through the Rocky Mountains, transformed Denver, the supply point for the mining areas, into the second largest city in the West after San Francisco. So Denver is just a supply point. And if you notice how they start building these railroads through the mountainous regions, and you come across things like these wooden trestle bridges, which had a sort of a drawback as the sparks from the wheels, metal on metal, sparks from the wheels and such like this, and those sparks would tend to catch the tinders on fire, and they would continuously have to check the tracks ahead of them. As you see, this one is burnt out bridge because of that. Now onto the ranching and cattle drives. In the early 1800s, Americans did not think ranches on the Great Plains were practical. The water was scarce, and cattle from the east could not survive on the tough prairie grasses. That's sage stuff. And they had memories of going out there in the early settling days as well. They're just saying, that's not a good idea. But the ranching and cattling did happen. As in, the Texas Longhorn was a breed discovered, and it descended from the Spanish cattle and could easily survive in the harsh climate of the plains, as over 5 million of them roamed Texas. So actually there's Spanish influence in what we call Mexico now that comes up and into what we call Texas now, because these places had different names at this. In 1866, ranchers rounded up cattle and drove about 260,000 of them to Missouri. Sedalia, Missouri. 260,000 Longhorn cattle. Now, this is what one of them looks like. They are scary and big. And these was what the cowboys who would drive the cattle would more or less look somewhat like that. Only a fraction of these herds survived the long drives, but overall it was a tremendous success, proving that cattle could be driven north to the rail lines to sell for a large profit. Guess steaks and beef. This is also where you get a Spanish influence coming up through the Mexico area into Texas and beyond, where these cattle drive cowhands, cowpokes. These guys, these early actual cowboys, have the lasso, their horse maneuvering, And all of those that turned into the rodeo or rodeo. It was just a informal show of look at the tricks I can do and what tricks can you do, and that's where you get your rodeo from, Spain via Mexico. Between 1867 and 1871, cowboys drove nearly 1.5 million cattle up the Chisholm Trail. Not all at once, but the Chisholm Trail was the drive for Abilene, Texas. I'm sorry this is worded up the Chisholm Trail to Abilene because that's Texas. This Chisholm Trail was more between Abilene, Texas, and Montana, where the grass was green. So they would drive up to Montana and down to Abilene. But then again, the Chisholm Trail is also how that might be the one that goes up to they load them on the trains to go to the slaughterhouse. But at the end, the mining town, these cow drive towns were just as rambunctious and roastabosto as the other mining towns that you hear of. And these long drives were very tiresome, I'm sure. The long drives, the stock from many different owners made up the herds. Life in the towns was exciting, but many cowboys told exaggerated tales of daring that often supplied material for what were called dime novels because they cost 10 cents. Here's some examples. I can relate to the one on the left. My first horse ride in Montana. Definitely. Anyhow, the 10-cent dime novels, and here they are. They would depict life in the West. Some of it looked like, I'm not sure how true these are, but this one's Buy an Old Scout, Deadwood Den. Okay, and so, there's probably real tales, and they just, livened them up. And some of them you get them here, the James Boys. I guess that's the James Gang. And these are like 1880 types of things. Ranching became big business. Of course it did. See, the livestock would go up the cattle drives to where the trains could take them to the east or to the west in California or to New York in Chicago, and the cattle went to the slaughterhouses and became steaks. So when the sheep herders had a different problem with the cattle farmers. Well, when the sheep herders moved their flocks into the range, when the farmers settled there, blocking the trails, range wars broke out among competing groups. So basically, farming went over into the area. They would set up their fences. This is my ranch. This is a farm, right? This is a farming area. And then the sheep would come in and either break through their fences or munch on their crop. So the free range herders and the farming settlers definitely had wars. And that probably inspired a lot of the law and lawless aspect of the Old West. And here's a couple more dime novels for the shooting of Jesse James and the apparently true life of Billy the Kid, depending who you listen to and how true the story was. I guess Jesse James was 25 cents. Billy the Kid was only a 5-cent novel. I don't know if that has any significance. Eventually, after the loss of lives, the range wars was largely fenced. Well, the ranges were largely fenced off with a new invention called barbed wire. So basically, welcome to barbed wire for the first time. They figured it out. They made this, and hey, let's put these barbed wires in. It enabled hundreds of square miles to be fenced off cheap and easy. So they started to do that, and here's a picture that made it into a stamp. I'm not sure what they're doing here. I'm not sure if this was a 160-acre Homestead Act stampede. I'm not sure what this is, but someone thought it was depicting of the Old West, and they made it into an early stamp. At first, ranchers did not want to abandon open grazing and complained when farmers put up barriers preventing the ranchers' livestock from roaming. Of course, here's a picture of a wolf dog, coyote biting a rope. I don't know. You'd have to ask these men in the 1800s, but this was what these are basic cowboys. This is kind of what you'd be looking at back then. Eventually, barbed wire allowed them to keep their animals closer to the sources of food and water. It also ended the excitement of the long cattle drives, as new European breeds of cattle replaced the Longhorns, and the cowboys transitioned into becoming ranch hands. And this is where the rough and rowdy shoot-'em-up cowboy becomes the rancher cowboy. Now, if you look at this map here from 1848 to 1890, see, it's a kind of a when does the Wild West end thing. Well, when you look at this one, you'll see the railroads. I pin it down to when the railroads are really up there. That's the end of the real Old West. So you have these railroads being put in. This is the Union Pacific line, I believe. And when you see these yellow spots are gold areas. Here's Leadville, Black Hill, Deadwoods. Here's Bannack. I'll get to that one day. And the cattle trails are in red. So here's the Chisholm Trail going from Fort Worth up to Abilene. So I was wrong. Abilene is in Kansas. My bad there. Fort Worth, Abilene, Texas, Kansas. There's the Chisholm Trail. But it's heading right to a railroad line, east and west. There's a Western Trail going up to Nebraska, and the Goodnight Lowing Trail, which is going way up here, Wyoming. Actually, they went farther up here too. So these ones would go up into the settlers that were farming. And once the farmers and the barbed wire set up and they were going back and forth and getting to the slaughterhouses, they were good to go. And that, my friends, my wee mongooses, is what a little bit of it was like in the Old West. Not exactly as it's depicted in our beloved Hollywood films as much, but it's probably much more ordinary folk doing a hard work in harsh conditions and getting along in that direction. All right, that's it. Aloha.